National and local foreclosure numbers are going up, and there's hidden risk in one particular loan type. Which one is it, and why should you care? We're going to let you know in the Southern California Foreclosure Report. This update was at least partially inspired by Victor, our YouTube subscriber. He had a great question. He was asking, what kind of impact do the government layoffs and other economic changes have on the foreclosure market? Now, Victor, it's a little too soon for that to show up in the data. We're not going to see the tariff uncertainty. We're not going to see those Doja layoffs showing up, because from missing a payment to starting the foreclosure process, that is anywhere from a 90 to 120 day process, and in fact it often takes much longer. As of March 2025, the average foreclosure from missed payment to foreclosure took 716 days. And away we go, starting with the notices of default. And the notice of default is the first time we're aware that somebody's behind on their payments because it's public. So this is a minimum of 120 days after a payment is missed in California that the notice of default will be filed. Next phase would be the notice of trustee sale and on to the sale. And we're looking 2025 all the way back to 2015, a lot of years of data. And this April is a busy April for notices of default. We can see that the numbers are up for 2025, catching up for lost years. Well, what do I mean by that? Starting in 2020, we had a foreclosure moratorium. Most of the properties that were behind, they could file for protection. Now, there were still some that weren't protected. So investor-owned properties and portfolio loans, those were examples of folks that could move forward and still foreclose on properties. That's why you still see notice of default. And we can see that 2025 for this data, all the way back to 2015, for these counties, this is the highest level of notice of default. Not a huge wave. We compared to 2011, and already by 2011, notices of default had been dropping. They'd been moving deeper into the foreclosure process. You'll see that in the numbers. So we're not at the peak where we were in the past. Track these numbers, track the foreclosures, because there will be properties that pop out. Big difference between 2025 and 2015 and before. These properties that are being foreclosed on, in many cases, have equity depending on when they were purchased. If you look back at the properties 2011 and around that time, most of these properties did not have equity. These folks were upside down because prices had dropped and the financing had been 100% plus. That's right. You'd actually get paid to buy a house back then. That's very true. There were certain loan types that would pay you to close. We don't have these anymore. FHA loans, where there's a low down payment, they don't have much wiggle room. So we're going to talk about those and how those numbers are changing. Next step, notice of trustee sale. So 90 days after the notice of default, in the fastest case scenario with the most wind at the back, then we'd have the notice of trustee sale filed. It would have a sale date. That sale date is a minimum of 21 days in the future. When we look at these numbers, that we don't have a peak in the notices of trustee sale. It has increased since 2020, but it's not as high as it was in years past. And then when we bring in 2011, you can see what I was talking about, where we had a huge number of notices of trustee sale at this point in time. So we're not seeing the notice of default yet sliding into notices of trustee sale. Moving into real estate owned. What's real estate owned? Well, that is a property that has gone through the auction process and has ended up going back to the lender. That is real estate owned by the lender. So that's an REO property. And we can see when we look at real tight window here that REOs were way down. No surprise, we had that foreclosure moratorium. We've got an increase in 2023. Like we talk about with these numbers, sometimes we don't fully trust it, even though we run it 10 or 12 times to double check. Sometimes there's anomalies. It is possible in San Bernardino in April of 2023, the 20 properties went back to the bank. Could be an anomaly. But at the end of the day, these are smaller numbers than we had way back in the global financial crisis days. You can see that we are at a tiny fraction, particularly when we bring in 2011. Put that in perspective. 1,444 properties going back to the bank in 2011. Those properties were going to be listed. These weren't properties that were purchased by a third party at auction so that they could be flipped. That did happen back then and continues to happen now. Huge number of properties ultimately being listed and coming to the market as inventory. Back then, we had a lot more inventory coming through the pipeline for foreclosed properties. And that's also why values were dropping back then. So we do have a bit of a road to go before we're going to get anywhere near the numbers we had during the global financial crisis for foreclosure inventory. Let's get a national perspective on how loans are doing by state. So this is from the ICE Mortgage Monitor report, and it shows us the percentage of delinquent properties, percentage of properties in foreclosure, percentage of non-current properties, and then the year-over-year change. So if we look at the national level, we have 3.2% of properties that are delinquent that have not yet moved into foreclosure, 0.4% in foreclosure, and that gives us a total of 3.6% non-current properties, and then the year-over-year change is 0.6. So that positive number means that the number of non-current properties has gone up nationally. Now this list with Louisiana at the highest level is the number of non-current properties at percentage. So 7.5% of properties in Louisiana are non-current. That's a big number, but it's actually a decrease year over year. Things have gotten better year over year in Louisiana. Another important thing to point out here, this asterisk refers to judicial foreclosure states. In order to foreclose on the property, it's going to need to go in front of a judge, typically a longer process for foreclosure. The ones without the asterisk, like California, where I'm from, non-judicial foreclosure. Doesn't need to go in front of a judge. California, we use a trustee and beneficiary system. So the trustee does everything for the Benny, and it's a theoretically faster process, still taking hundreds and hundreds of days to foreclose on a property. These are arranged by non-current percentage of loans, and that is very important to see. But to me, what's even more important to look at is how they're doing year over year. And we do have some states with pretty big increases. Florida, for example, we've heard a lot of bad news about Florida due to an increase in inventory. We've got an increase in the cost of insurance and insurance carriers dropping people. So we are seeing prices dropping in Florida. At the same time, we have 10.3% year-over-year increase in the number of properties that are non-current. If that continues to move in that direction, if we get a higher and higher percentage of properties that are non-current, that's going to add even more inventory to the market. So very helpful to see this year-over-year change. We have a link below if you want to take a deeper dive. And then we see places like Hawaii where year-over-year that number is down significantly. North Dakota, down significantly. California, despite all the negative things we get about California, we're actually not doing too terrible in the number of delinquent loans and non-current loans, but a 5% increase year-over-year in non-current loans. Helpful stuff. Keep track on this. More important information from the ICE Mortgage Monitor. Look, we're not running around talking about the market crashing, huge foreclosure wave. Part of the reason we see these increases in certain states like Florida and California were due to natural disasters. For example, this property right here. Here's a prime example. This is a property, unfortunately, that suffered the effects of the Palisades fire, and the estimated value is around $10 million, and it's being foreclosed on. So at this point in time, there's an auction that has been scheduled to foreclose on a property that's just a pile of ash. Very sad to see. And this is the case with the natural disasters inflating the foreclosure numbers in California. Now remember, I mentioned the FHA loans. So delinquencies are below pre-pandemic levels, but serious delinquencies, that's properties over 90 days late, that is up, and it is almost exclusively attributed to FHA loans. In fact, it's the serious delinquencies for FHA loans is at the highest it's been since ICE began reporting this at the turn of the century, and only 22% of those FHA loans that are over 3 payments behind are in active foreclosure. And why is that? Well, there were protections put in place for FHA loans that will now be expiring. FHA loans have special protection for those who got behind on payments due to COVID, and that's about to change. So for loans that are 61 days or later in their payments, those folks can go ahead and apply through April 30th, 2025. But the special programs or loan modification and other programs, those will expire on September 30th, 2025. So once that hits, once that expires, we may find a flood of FHA properties going into the foreclosure process. And don't forget that FHA properties tend to have a lower down payment and may have less of an equity buffer than some of the other properties out there, particularly for properties where we're seeing prices drop in the local area, or for properties that were purchased in 2023, 2024, 2025. They're going to have less equity. So that's what we need to keep an eye on, is the level of FHA inventory. So the level of essentially hidden FHA foreclosure inventory will start to come into light towards fourth quarter of this year. And one more chart to weave into this narrative is, where are we with the levels of inventory and where can we expect things to be in fourth quarter and when those FHA properties might start to hit the market? Well, this chart from Altos shows the level of inventory. That's the black line. We are almost to more normal pre-COVID levels of inventory. The green line is the percentage of properties that have decreased their price. So this is a seller that comes to the market, says, uh-oh, we're too high, we need to decrease our price in an attempt to get the property under contract. This big, huge swing from 20% up here to 43%, that's when we had the Ukraine war and the Fed fund rate started to go up as well. So we had almost 50% of properties at the national level doing a price reduction in order to go under contract. More normal years, so these dots are year over year. So in May of 2018, we had about 27% properties, about 1 in 4. We can see now that we're going up and we're at around 36 to 37%. So this is showing us that inventory is increasing and the percentage of properties dropping prices to go under contract, that is also increasing as well. So when these FHA properties start to hit the market, and they don't even need to be foreclosed on, if they decide, hey, I'm going to hit the market, I need to get rid of this property because I can't stay up on my payments, they could be house rich, cash poor, that does happen. They're going to be coming into a market where we see an increase in inventory and more sellers dropping prices. So there's a lot to track here coming up through the rest of 2025. If you're digging our data, you're our kind of people. Don't even think about buying or selling in SoCal without reaching out to our team first. Thanks for tuning in. This has been Christian Walsh, real estate agent with Wire Associates, and we can't wait to help you.